The remake is a delicate balancing act, and one that developer Bloober Team faces in bringing a cherished 2001 classic like Silent Hill 2 to a new generation. The good news is that the Silent Hill 2 remake, released on PlayStation 5 and PC, does capture the essence, the atmosphere of Konami's survival horror, all while making smart upgrades to its design. Despite rebuilding the game on Unreal Engine 5, you'll still recognise its iconic, foggy view over the Toluca Lake at the game's start. The cutscenes are now acted out with new motion capture and voiceovers, and while in control, you'll explore Silent Hill's woodland trails and apartment blocks with an updated controller scheme, complete with newly devised puzzles. Likewise, its soundtrack is rearranged by legendary composer Akira Yamaoka, and even the world layout, the ordering of events, is remixed at points to keep fans old and new alike on their toes. Even through all these changes though, at its core, Bloober Team still successfully takes apart and puts back together the beating heart of what made the 2001 original work. Today then, I'm honing in on the PlayStation 5 release, while my good friend Alex Battaglia is of course on point as ever for the PC version in a separate video. The fact of the matter is, and despite my praise for Bloober's overall retelling of Silent Hill 2's story, the remake's use of Unreal Engine 5's technology has pros and cons while playing on console. So first of all, how much of a visual overhaul is the remake over the PlayStation 2 original? Side by side, we know going in it's going to be a pretty substantial upgrade, but how is Konami's original blueprint for each area brought to life today via UE5, where the engine's Lumen technology is at work for reflections and global illumination? A shout out to Marc Duddleson of My Life in Gaming for supplying this crisp PS2 capture via a RetroTink 4K here. Thank you so much. Secondly, what's the best way to play on PS5 between its two modes, its 30 frames per second quality mode and 60 frames per second performance mode? And finally, as ever, do either of these modes hit their frame rate target, or are there struggles in locking at a stable reading either way? Let's find out. Okay, retro comparisons first. The comparisons to the PlayStation 2 original often speaks for itself. We're talking about a 23-year gap between the two games after all, and the result is as transformative as you'd expect. To start, the pre-rendered CG cutscenes used on PS2, often deployed for close-ups like this shot of James gazing into the mirror, are now replaced with in-engine renders. The remake recreates each moment in real time via Unreal Engine 5, bolstered by more advanced skin shaders, lighting interaction with cloth, and crucially, a greater nuance to facial animations too. The design of each character is also adjusted to suit a 4K presentation on PS5 here. You'll notice buttons and more prominent zips are added to James's olive green jacket, while later on, Maria shows off a reworked look, a different choker, a newly positioned butterfly tattoo, and more exaggerated pink highlights. So yes, Bloober Team takes some creative liberties here. Understandably, fans of the 2001 original will be surely attached to those original designs, and it might be hard to accept any change. Still, the remake's changes are very deliberate, and are added in the spirit of what each character represents in the story. Switching to the in-engine visuals on PS2, the remake's upgrades here are inevitably even more stark. Often the events and dialogue of a cutscene are similar, but the pacing is more often than not altered due to the new motion capture performance, and they're also presented at new camera angles. In the end, I've really had to dig deep here to find shots that roughly match, but not every scene will sync up. The fact of the matter is, looking back, the in-engine PS2 models worked beautifully on the CRT displays of the day, running at an internal resolution of 512 by 448. However, the expectations of a remake, and especially one targeting modern 4K displays, is that model and asset quality need an equivalent step up. It's also clear that the original developer, Team Silent, truly relied on those pre-rendered cinematics for any real up-close facial expressions, while these in-engine scenes, using simplified character models and more basic lip flap movements, worked much better for wider camera angle shots. The remake, on the other hand, demands the best of both worlds. The 4K presentation means that every cutscene gets full performance capture, often inserting character close-ups where previously it just couldn't be achieved. Again, the remake's revised cutscene direction might not be to everyone's tastes, but it's a technical advance that allows for a more detailed acting performance that just wasn't possible back in 2001.
Hey, it was you, wasn't it? You're the one who stepped on my hand.
The second half of the visual upgrade is in Silent Hill itself, the location. Bloober's remake goes to great lengths to reinterpret the concept of each landmark using Unreal Engine 5. The result isn't always a strictly precise one-to-one recreation, mind you, but through the downhill route to Toluca Lake and each shop across the town streets, it's all very recognizable. Again, the challenge in framing any comparison is working around the new over-the-shoulder camera, so admittedly some repositioning is needed here. Still, using PS5's quality mode for example, every geometric detail is reworked from scratch. Between the abandoned cars, the shop signs, every material reveals a huge vault in detail, backed by real-time indirect lighting via Lumen GI. Certainly down the initial route, through Silent Hill's woodlands, we keep the very tightly linear structure of the original. Visibility is pushed a little farther afield in the remake, but it's still a very faithful recreation of the game's eerie introduction. And best of all, the transitions between each area, from this forest route to the graveyard, to the ranch, to the apartments, are all now seamless, avoiding the fade to black loading screens of the original. Delving even deeper into Silent Hill's world, Bloober has excelled in judging where and what to add to the experience, while keeping the overall pacing intact. New areas of the town are opened out to the player, for example, like this one early side road en route to the ranch which was previously fenced off. There's also a suitably more climactic setting to the first boss battle too, with Pyramid Head, filled as it is with destructible cages, where previously this battle just took place in a pretty barren room. We even have new and surprisingly well-designed puzzles, one highlight being this cryptic, moth-themed room. Much of this is only additive to the experience, but then Bloober also has the sense to keep what worked in the original's iconic visual direction. So for example, the bloody scrawls across Neely's bar are a letter-for-letter match, while our very first ominous glimpse of Pyramid Head through those barred apartment hallways is kept in too. Beyond all of these recreated moments, one element that shines in the remake is the detail added above the player. Where before, on PS2, we had this mixture of fixed static views and a limited, horizontally orientated 3D camera, the remake instead encourages us to look up and down to catch details. And so, Bloober Team fills in the blanks, so to speak. We're now able to see the sheer scale of landmarks like the church from a ground view, the traffic lights dangling in the wind, and even the daunting height of the town's sheet-covered blockades. It's great stuff. One final point. Looking back at the PS2 version, there's one aspect that's perhaps lost in translation, that being the texture of the image itself. In some ways, the original's rather coarse image quality dates itself to a specific time in games technology, to the first wave of PS2 titles essentially, in an era of CRTs, and this only really adds to Silent Hill 2's mystique. Much like the best works of horror, in films or otherwise, there's a power to the way the game obscures the image, to almost having a found footage VHS look, and back then, the PS2 version's sharp edges and heavy film grain formed an integral part of its atmosphere. Today's remake does of course do away with that gritty, grimy aesthetic in favour of a cleaner modern one. It's expected, and while we do keep a subtle degree of film grain in place and chromatic aberration, it's just not quite the same. In fairness, Bloober does add an optional 90s filter toggle in the remake, which approximately color grades the game in a similar fashion to the original, but it's really only a token gesture. All of which brings us to the remake's modes. To cut to the point, PS5 offers two options here, a default quality mode that runs at 30 frames per second and also a 60 FPS performance mode. Now, each one of these uses UE5's Lumen technology, with lumen reflections and global illumination, allowing for an approximated ray-traced solution to reflections on water and lighting its dark interiors. However, point one is that the quality presets for both lumen reflections and GI are lowered on the performance mode. Also, there's a resolution drop to bear in mind on that mode too. Specifically, the quality mode runs with dynamic scaling between 1224p and 1512p, while the performance mode drops that range to 864p up to 1152p. There's a temporal upscale in place on both sides, resolving to a 4K image, but expectedly, it has a bigger uphill battle with more reconstruction artifacts with that 60fps mode. Frustratingly, there's often no ignoring the visual artifacts that go with this temporal upscale. Even on the quality mode, running at its higher target 1512p, you'll still spot motion banding in the background. Difference number two between the modes is a drop in lumen GI and reflection quality. The performance mode takes a hit on both counts. The effect is often best noticed around the red glow of these save points, where performance mode appears to remove local lighting quality or near-field high-quality SDF representation. The impact is more oftentimes obvious indoors, where the quality mode's higher lumen GI setting often brightens the back of bars via additional bounce lighting and also reflecting the hue of nearby coloured objects. Switching back and forth, the quality mode also adds pockets of shade to shelves, though in most cases the improved GI makes for a more subtle difference. As for lumen reflections, this is a much more noticeable difference in play. Both modes, of course, use lumen reflections, with a screen space reflection method as a fallback, but again, it's that lumen component that sees a drop in quality on the performance mode. The result is, sadly, at times, a flickering mess of pixels on puddles while running at 60fps. Note how it creates this temporarily unstable, pixelated mirror image on the street floor, which is fixed on the quality mode. Those are the differences then. Between the two modes, all settings stay the same otherwise, from shadow resolution, textures, and beyond. It's primarily the native resolution range for each mode then, and the lumen quality settings that divide them. Also, given cutscenes run at 30fps in either mode either way, it's really only gameplay that's affected. You keep the thick volumetric fog effect either way, and the overall level of detail across the town stays intact. Now, sadly, this parity between the modes also extends to issues in controls and visual bugs. To go for the negatives here for a second, there's a Resident Evil 2 Remake style over-the-shoulder view for gun controls and melee, and while it generally works, Bloober does run into an issue with the camera logic while indoors. Too often I found, especially around the tight confines of the apartment block, the camera just struggles to find space to keep the action in frame, making enemies really hard to track. It's my only major gripe with the game design itself. Otherwise, there are also occasional visual bugs which do stand out, like this odd banding artifact on frosted windows, and this white halo SSR disocclusion artifact around enemies. Finally, let's touch on performance. PS5's 30fps quality mode runs fully V-synced, and while it does hit the mark most of the time, it's also evident that there are plenty of one-frame blips and even lurches into the high 20s during action. These are very rarely extreme, but these blips are still a semi-regular distraction from what should be a fluid 30fps line. One very provable cause of these drops is the dynamic nature of the resolution. Simply put, abruptly changing the GPU load by raising the camera to the sky where the resolution increases and then suddenly dropping the camera to eye level causes a momentary lurch under 30fps, pretty much every time. The dynamic resolution scaling system only has this brief window to react, to change the pixel output based on the complexity of the scene ahead. In that moment, and in others, like as we swing the camera around the courtyard pool area here, UE5 cannot render a frame within a 33.3 millisecond window, and so we lose a cluster of frames until the resolution adjusts. Perhaps then, in theory, the resolution bounds needed to be more aggressive here. Perhaps there should be a greater performance overhead above that 30 FPS cap to cater for any potential GPU taxing moments. But alas, this is how PS5 runs in the quality mode right now. With the higher Lumen GI and reflection settings in tow, the quality mode is actually how I played most of the remake. I'd especially recommend it to those without a VRR display. But it's still clearly a shame that it's not a 100% smooth way to enjoy the game at 30 FPS. It really doesn't matter where you look. The apartments, the open, free exploration of Silent Hill streets, or battles with Pyramid Head. There's always this persistent trickle of dropped frames behind every turn and gunshot. Switching to the performance mode, we drop to an 1152p target at maximum, and those Lumen reflections take a visible hit in quality outdoors. It's also apparent that 60 FPS is a stretch for PS5, even when the resolution bottoms out at 864p. Sadly, the Silent Hill 2 remake doesn't put its best foot first with that woodland route to Toluca Lake, the graveyard section, or the ranch in the opening hour. These foggy, foliage-packed areas tank PS5's reading, taking it well into the mid-40s and even briefly dipping into the high 30s in one later courtyard pool area. It truly overextends the ideal range for a VRR display this way, and there's not enough frame data to turn around a perceptually smooth result. The upside is, after those initial areas, the town streets do typically run at the 60 FPS line on PS5. It actually hits the mark for hours at a time in the South Vale region, across each shop, with a similar unfortunate trend of one-frame blips and dips to the quality mode, at worst. Likewise, getting into that dark, linear apartment block area puts 60 FPS into view most of the time, though as you ascend to the third floor, with more detailed, dilapidated rooms, the reading does unfortunately start to plummet more frequently into the 50s. So a warning ahead of time. I played through the game's first 6 hours, and performance mode is often a mixed bag. The Silent Hill 2 remake is a strong effort then, being all at once faithful to the spirit of the Konami original, while also daring to avoid being too literal in its translation. The newly added puzzles, the ability to soak in the town's details from any angle, and grander boss set pieces with Pyramid Head all add something tangible to the package. Even so, the remake does have clear, technical rough edges to address. PS5's performance is a chief concern here. Whether it's ultimately solved via patch updates, or even by brute force of running on better future console hardware, I'm itching to see a way to get a tighter 60 FPS lock. Equally, it's a shame that current PS5 hardware struggles to keep the 30 FPS mode locked down, despite being its default mode with preferable Lumen quality settings. On balance then, Bloober Team's remake still makes a great many more right decisions than wrong ones. Against all expectations going in, it ranks as a success overall, with some room to improve post-release. But that's all from me today. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video and many more, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, you know where to find me. But from me for now, thanks for watching.